This is something you have to know. Okay. Space over there. I can squeeze that in. So less than or equal to 40. And for CO2, greater or equal to 46. Okay. All right. Now this blood that is approaching these cells and tissue, what do you call this circulatory pattern? Is it the systemic circulation or the pulmonary circulation? Systemic. So therefore, the contents of this blood has very high amount of oxygen. So in the plasma, what is the partial pressure of oxygen there? 100. How about the partial pressure of CO2?
40.
40. So as far as the amount of CO2 in that arterial blood, this number is important so that you can adequately deliver oxygen to these cells. For CO2, this number is important to maintain the pH of the blood. Okay? CO2 is more important for the maintenance of the pH of the blood. Oxygen is important for your cells to live. All right, so that's the whole point. All right, so let's talk about certain things first. So let's talk about how CO2 basically will move around this particular area, and then we'll also kind of add that to how oxygen also is moving between these two areas. So clearly you can see there's a discrepancy, there's a difference in the amount of CO2, right? CO2 in the cells much higher than the amount of CO2 in that blood. So CO2 diffuses out of the cell into the interstitial space, and then from the interstitial space into the plasma. Okay? Once CO2 diffuses into the plasma, what happens to the partial pressure of CO2 in the plasma? Increases to what? 46. So already you have one method of CO2 transport that's happening. Okay. Now, of course, most of that CO2 is not going to stay in the plasma because there's only 7% of the CO2, total amount of CO2 transported in the plasma. So then the CO2 will actually diffuse all the way into the red blood cell. Once inside the red blood cell, the CO2 is going to combine with water to form carbonic acid. And it never stays in this form, right? It gets converted immediately into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. Okay? Now, inside this red blood cell, you have a bunch of oxyhemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin bound to oxygen. So this is oxyhemoglobin. When you start to increase the amount of CO2 concentration, or in this particular area, because it has a very high partial pressure of CO2, and as CO2 diffuses into this red blood cell, it's going to also raise the hydrogen ion concentration. So remember those several factors that basically decreases the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. One of them is an increase in the partial pressure of CO2. The other one is acidity, which is a decrease in pH. Okay, so these two factors now play a role because this hydrogen ion now will basically start to interact with this oxyhemoglobin. Okay, when that happens, because of that acidity, now you have to have a way to neutralize the acidity. So hemoglobin starts to have a decrease in affinity toward oxygen, and therefore will kick off or unload the oxygen from its bonds and pick up the hydrogen ion. So therefore becoming deoxyhemoglobin and releasing out an oxygen molecule. Okay. This bicarb something has to be done with this bicarb, because if it lingers around inside the red blood cell, it's going to recombine with the hydrogen ion and then gets made back into CO2. If you have more CO2 inside the red blood cell compared to your cells and tissues, then the CO2 will diffuse backward, which is very, very bad for the body, which never really happens. But, sort of like just theoretical situation, it may happen, right? So to prevent this backward shifting back into CO2 and therefore backward diffusion to the cells and tissue, we need to take this bicarb and move it out of the red blood cell. Okay, so there's a protein on the surface of this red blood cell which will allow you to transport the bicarb out into the plasma. But in order for you to move the bicarb out, you're now actually losing a negative charge inside this red blood cell. So you have to balance that with something. So what's another negatively charged ion that you may possibly have inside the blood? Chloride. You take a chloride and you transport it into this red blood cell. Okay? We call this the chloride shift. Okay? This is like a dance. Now, once chloride enters this red blood cell, since there's a bunch of deoxyhemoglobin, so imagine you have deoxyhemoglobin here, the chloride will interact with the deoxyhemoglobin. And as the chloride interacts with the deoxyhemoglobin, it allows for it to basically be more attracted to CO2. So some of the CO2 that has been transported into the red blood cell will now start to interact with hemoglobin, okay? Or let's just put it, yeah, we can put it that way. So chloride is going to interact with the deoxyhemoglobin and allowing the deoxyhemoglobin to now pick up a CO2. So when that happens, this becomes carb-amino hemoglobin. Make sense? Okay. So you do need that chloride because the chloride is going to help that deoxyhemoglobin to pick up the CO2 to convert it into a carb-amino hemoglobin. Okay. All right, so all of this here is just basically talking about how CO2 is moving, diffusing rapidly from the cell into the red blood cell. As far as oxygen is concerned, you can see that once the hydrogen ion starts to accumulate, this then decreases the affinity of this hemoglobin toward oxygen, therefore unload this oxygen. So oxygen will then diffuse progressively into that cell, okay? How much of that oxygen has been unloaded from hemoglobin? 22%. Roughly about 22%, or give or take 220 million of those particular billion compounds of oxygen, okay? Which means, what's the amount of oxyhemoglobin that you have left inside this red blood cell as it moves into the venous circulation? What's the percent oxyhemoglobin saturation? 75%. And what's the purpose of that high amount of oxygen still bound to hemoglobin?
Oxygen reserve.
They act as an immediate oxygen reserve, just in case you come across a cell of the body that has a much higher metabolic activities, you're gonna dump more oxygen or unload more of that oxygen to those cells and tissues, right? Immediately. Because you're not gonna breathe fast enough to replenish that, right? Cellularly speaking, it is reacting much faster than you can physically breathe in and breathe out. Okay, so you have to have a very high reserve of oxygen for that immediate activities. All right, another thing will happen is that this oxygen right here will diffuse from the plasma progressively into the cell. So once that happens, the amount of oxygen decreases down to 40. Okay, so in this particular scenario, there's three methods of CO2 transport. One is to be transported directly dissolved as plasma. Two is to become carb-amino hemoglobin. And three is to be converted into bicarbonate ion and transported within the circulation or within the plasma. And conversion into bicarb is the major method of CO2 transport within the blood. Okay? All right. Okay, so now imagine this red blood cell. So this red blood cell now returns to the lungs. So here's your alveoli. Okay. blood is moving again in this direction. Okay. So in the alveoli, we know that they have a very high partial pressure of oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs is about 105, or in the alveoli, and partial pressure of CO2 in the alveoli is 40. Okay. This blood here is within what we call the pulmonary circulation. So coming from the right side of the heart being pumped into the lungs, it is now transporting very low amount of oxygen in the plasma and higher amount of CO2 in the plasma. Okay? So then you can see immediately there is a discrepancy of these gases. So in this particular case, we're going to talk about oxygen. So oxygen will diffuse out into the interstitial space from the alveoli and diffuse into the red blood, into the plasma. Once it diffuses into the plasma, it's going to raise the partial pressure of oxygen immediately to 100. Okay. Now, most of that oxygen is not going to stay in the plasma because the vast majority, like 97% of these guys, will diffuse into the red blood cell. Once it diffuses into the red blood cell, let's say if you still have a bunch of deoxyhemoglobin that is not bound to carbon dioxide, the oxygen will attack that hemoglobin. It wants to now bind to that hemoglobin, okay? Once it does that, and the reason why it does that also is because, remember, high partial pressure of oxygen favors the loading of oxygen onto hemoglobin because it's a steric type of interaction, it's a pressure type of interaction. So therefore, once oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it reforms oxyhemoglobin and it kicks off a hydrogen ion, okay? Now, you have to do something with that hydrogen, otherwise it will become very acidic in this red blood cell. And if that's the case, that high acidity will cause hemoglobin to drop off or unload that oxygen, okay, because of those factors that we talked about, okay? So you need to neutralize this. In order to neutralize this, you need the bicarb. But that bicarb is out here. And it cannot be transported into that red blood cell until you take that chloride and you shift it back out. But the chloride is basically hovering around that carbaminohemoglobin, because remember, in this particular activities here, the chloride helps that deoxyhemoglobin to pick up the CO2, okay? So imagine the chloride is still there. I just didn't draw it in here. Let me just draw it in here. So it's just sticking around. It's not like bound to that hemoglobin at all. It's just basically hovering around there, being attracted because of, you know, certain opposite charge thing. So in order to kick all of this off, the oxygen that diffuses into this red blood cell also approaches all of this and start to attack that hemoglobin. Once it does that, it displaced both the chloride and the CO2 off of this hemoglobin, okay? So therefore, it will convert this back into oxyhemoglobin, while the CO2 is now displaced, and sorry, not the bicarb, but the chloride. And the chloride ions also kicked off, okay? So again, the oxygen will basically displace the carbaminohemoglobin and reform oxyhemoglobin for that red blood cell. The chloride, now freed from its interaction, is shifted out into the plasma in exchange for bicarbonate. Okay? We call this the reverse chloride shift. Sense? All right, so in this particular reverse chloride shift, now you have bicarb shifting back in and chloride being transported out of this red blood cell. Immediately, bicarb and hydrogen ion will reform carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will be immediately converted into water and CO2. Okay? So the two forms of oxygen transport in this scenario is one, being transported directly in the plasma, and two, being transported bound to hemoglobin. Okay? So what's the fate of the CO2? Well, once the CO2 is displaced from this carbamino hemoglobin right here, that's CO2, which is diffused into the alveoli. Okay? Once that bicarb has been converted back into CO2, that CO2 also diffused out of the red blood cell into the alveoli. The amount of CO2 in the plasma immediately will diffuse into the alveoli. So once that plasma concentration of CO2 diffuses, the partial pressure of CO2 drops back down to 40. Okay? Any questions about this? So, chloride shift, reverse chloride shift. During what gas exchange event or interface is the chloride shift happening?
Systemic
Internal respiration. Okay, respiration refers to gas exchange. So anytime I ask about the gas exchange interface or gas exchange events between the circulation and whatever parts of the body, it's either internal versus external respiration. And therefore, the reverse chloride shift occurs during the external respiration activities or event. Okay. Now, my question to you guys is this: if this is a continuous event because it never stops, what's going to happen to the partial pressure of oxygen and CO2 within the alveoli? If oxygen continues to diffuse out of the alveoli and CO2 continues to diffuse into the alveoli, what's going to happen to the partial pressure of those gases? So partial pressure oxygen will decrease. Partial pressure of CO2 will increase. Why is it always the same? Because we breathe. That's why we don't hold our breath. Because if we do, we'll die. So when we breathe, what are we doing? How are we, what's the process of breathing? And what do we call that? So we call it ventilation. Okay? So in the atmosphere, you have partial pressure of oxygen. What's the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere? 730? Damn, that's a lot of oxygen. You actually would die if you have that high amount of oxygen, because oxygen is actually very toxic to the body. You think about the total pressure, that's 760. So roughly 160 millimeters of mercury. Let's take away like 600 of this. What about the amount of CO2?
40.
0.3.
No.
Millimeters of mercury, okay, in the atmosphere at sea level. Okay, even assuming the most like polluted area of the country or wherever you guys want to think about. Now, in order for you to exchange gases, right, you're gonna have oxygen entering the alveoli and CO2 leaving the alveoli. Make sense? Okay, so when you inhale, that's when you bring in oxygen. When you exhale, that's when you take out the CO2. We call this process ventilation. So how do we inhale oxygen from the air? It's a very simple question, right? Answer it based on the physiology. Don't answer it. Don't say we breathe in. That's the same thing as inhalation. So how do we breathe in the air, the oxygen from the air? You contract the diaphragm and you contract the external intercostal muscles. And when you do that, what happens?
Sucks in.
How does the air get sucked in?
Because it's like tightened apart.
So tell me, in terms of physiology, what is happening when you contract your diaphragm and you contract your external intercostal muscle?
Decrease thoracic pressure.
You decrease your intrapulmonary pressure or the intra-alveolar pressure. That is the pressure that opposes the atmospheric pressure. And when you do that, how much what's the amount of pressure that you decrease in your lungs? 3 millimeters of mercury compared to whatever the atmospheric pressure is. That is enough to allow air to move from high pressure gradient to low pressure gradient. Make sense? So you're bringing in a huge amount of this air, about 500 mils of air. Some of it's going to be oxygen, most of it's going to be nitrogen. Okay? And then if you want to exhale out the CO2, all you have to do is simply relax the diaphragm and relax the external intercostal muscle, allowing for the lungs to naturally recoil. That increases the intrapulmonary pressure 3 millimeters of mercury above the atmospheric pressure. So air will now move from high pressure to low pressure gradient. And that's exhalation. Yeah? That's what I want you guys to understand. And that's how I want you guys to explain these if anybody asks you for the rest of your life. Okay? Questions about the chloride shift and reverse chloride shift? So next time you inhale and exhale, understand the mechanism of bringing air in and out of your lungs. And understand, once you inhale that air, all of this is happening simultaneously and immediately. And if you don't inhale air, this process is still ongoing, right? And how is it that this process is ongoing, and how is it that the body can maintain oxygen even if you hold your breath? And you can't hold your breath for a long time. Let's just say you hold your breath for like 30 seconds. But during that 30 seconds, your body is still, your cells are still receiving the same amount of oxygen. It's not depleted. Well, first you have an oxygen reserve. Secondly, you have that residual volume. You guys remember the leftover volume inside the lungs? So therefore, there's still oxygen in that volume, and there is a constant diffusion of that oxygen into the blood, no matter what, okay? So everything that's inside the body is to ensure that you don't die, right? The only time that you actually die is when you actually cause yourself to die because you alter your physiology in some way, shape, or form. All right, good. Let's talk about the regulation of breathing. So please know the reverse chloride shift and chloride shift for your lecture exam more so than the lab exam, okay? Okay. So to regulate the breathing activities that you have, we call this the chemoreceptor reflex. This is a reflexive response based on the change in the chemical contents of your blood. And what are the chemical contents of your blood? Partial pressure of CO2, the pH, and the partial pressure of oxygen. Those are the chemical contents inside your blood that is detected by the chemoreceptors responsible for, regulating the breathing mechanism. Now, before we actually get into this discussion, in the pons and in your medulla, there's actually 2 centers in the pons and 2 centers in the medulla that actually help regulate your breathing. In the pons, you have a center we call the pneumotaxic center. Okay. This is the godfather of all regulatory process of ventilation. If something happens to this pneumotaxic center, game over, okay? So it regulates the rate and depth of ventilation by sending out action potentials to basically allowing for the muscles to contract and relax at a certain amount of time, different duration patterns, okay? So pneumotaxic center, very important. The other center in the pons is called the apneustic center. And the apneustic center, under normal situation, is actually inhibited by the pneumotaxic center. The apneustic center is only active during forced inspiration, okay? When you are forcibly inhaling air into your lungs, okay? Otherwise, it's actually not very active. In the medulla, there's a center we call the dorsal respiratory group. The dorsal respiratory group basically receives all information from your chemoreceptors. So the chemoreceptors in the periphery detect these chemical changes in the blood and relay this information to the dorsal respiratory group, okay? The dorsal respiratory group also communicates with the pneumotaxic center, and from there receives a command from the pneumotaxic center to do whatever you need to do to basically regulate your breathing. The dorsal respiratory group also is responsible for the motor output to regulate normal ventilation. Okay. Now, for normal ventilation, there are two different ways for you to breathe normally. One method is the most common one, which is something that you don't even realize you're doing. So it's a subconscious or involuntary phase of normal ventilation. So you have involuntary normal ventilation. And the other phase is the conscious phase of normal breathing, because now you become aware of your breathing activity. So we call this the voluntary phase of normal ventilation, right? So let's say if you guys aren't aware of it, you're still breathing, that's an involuntary phase. But if I tell you, okay, everybody now start breathing normally, now you, all of a sudden you become very conscious about how you can generate this air in and out of your lungs, right? As it's clearly demonstrated by the fact that when you guys are breathing normally, you actually generate a higher amount of tidal volume when you're consciously thinking about breathing normally. Because you're like, well, how do I breathe normally? So you're actually taking in more air and breathing out more air, right? I don't know if you guys saw Anton was like generating a huge amount of like tidal volume as he's trying to breathe normally, because he doesn't know how to breathe normally under conscious control, under this awareness of breathing. It's kind of weird, but that's true because nobody does, okay? So that's the dorsal respiratory group. It is responsible for, first of all, receiving all of the sensory information about the chemical contents inside the blood. Secondly, it communicates with the pneumotaxic center. Thirdly, it also regulates the involuntary portion of normal ventilation. Okay, so there's three things that the dorsal respiratory group does. Okay, so I'll write it out for you. Receives chemo sensory info. Okay, so things about changes in your partial pressure of CO2, changes in the pH, and changes in the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. Those are the chemicals. Okay. Secondly, communicates with the pneumotaxic center. Okay. Basically asking for permission to do what it needs to do. Thirdly, regulates what we call involuntary normal ventilation. Okay. The other center inside the medulla is called the ventral respiratory group. One is dorsal, toward the back, one's ventral, toward the front. That's all, just collection of neurons in the back and the front. The ventral respiratory group doesn't receive the chemosensory information. The ventral respiratory group doesn't communicate with the pneumotaxic center. The ventral respiratory group is only responsible for the regulation, so basically it regulates voluntary normal ventilation and regulates forced both inhalation and exhalation. So any forced ventilation will be regulated by your ventral respiratory group. Okay? Dorsal respiratory group, in terms of the regulation of breathing, only regulates involuntary. So it's only responsible for the involuntary portion of your ventilation. Okay, so let's draw this out. So in the pond, you have the pneumotaxic center. And the apneustic center. Under normal circumstances, neurons from the pneumotaxic center will inhibit the activities of the apneustic center, okay, normally. And then in the medulla, you have the dorsal respiratory group, which we'll call it the DRG. Please don't abbreviate, unless I tell you. And sometimes I forget to tell you, so don't abbreviate if I don't tell you. And the other one is the ventral respiratory group. This is in the pons. This is in your medulla oblongata. All right. Just gonna draw a couple of spinal cord segments here, because you do need to relay this information to the spinal cord. One of the spinal cord segment is the cervical spinal cord, and the other one is your thoracic spinal cord. And then out here, let's draw the heart, but the actual cardiac muscle is not as important as these particular centers up here. Okay, so you have these branches, once again. Okay, from the heart. And then this other type of effectors that's more important in terms of this, because we're talking about regulation of breathing, so we have to then draw in the lungs. Okay. There's a huge muscle here. That's your diaphragm muscle. Okay. And the other muscle group is basically something like this. Okay, just drawing two representations of that. This is your external. Intercostal muscles. Sense? All right, so here's the setup. Now, on the heart itself, there are chemoreceptors that are responsible for detecting all these chemical changes. Okay? So there are a set of chemoreceptors located right at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery before it splits into the internal and external carotid artery. Okay. We call this the carotid bodies. And the carotid bodies is actually right next to your carotid sinus. You guys remember the carotid sinus? Containing baroreceptors that detect changes in pressure as you pump blood out of the heart, right? On the aortic arch, you also have a series of these chemoreceptors, and we call this the aortic bodies. Okay, and they are located right next to your aortic arch baroreceptors, which detect pressure changes within the aortic arch. Okay, so therefore, those two areas detect chemical changes are actually related to the two areas that detect pressure changes, because the information about any of those contents are relayed progressively almost back to the same place within the medulla. Okay? Remember, for the pressure changes, it's relayed back to both the cardiogenic center and the vasomotor center of the medulla, right? Those centers are basically right next to the DRG. Okay? sometimes kind of blending in together with that, but we don't have to worry about that because I'm not gonna overlap it and make you guys think like, oh yeah, all of this is connected. But they are. Anyhow, so the carotid bodies are actually more sensitive to these chemical changes than the aortic bodies. So with the carotid body, it will detect changes in partial pressure of CO2, detect changes in the pH, detect changes in the partial pressure of oxygen. For the carotid bodies, it cares mainly about the partial pressure of CO2 and the pH. Less so the partial pressure of oxygen, okay? Because it knows that's already oxygen. The carotid bodies care about that more because that oxygen is now going into the blood, into the brain itself. So therefore, that oxygen content is a lot more important as it is being delivered to the brain tissue. Okay, so from the carotid bodies, you're gonna relay this information to the DRG, right? Because this is also coming from the carotid area, this is transmitted via your glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, so cranial nerve number 9. From the aortic bodies, this information is also being transported or being transmitted to the DRG. And because it's on the heart, this is transmitted via the vagus nerve. Okay, so these are the two sensory components, sensory nerves, that relay information about the chemical changes within the contents of the blood that is now circulating within the aortic arch and the common carotid artery. Okay. Once the DRG receives this information, the first thing the DRG does before anything is to communicate with the pneumotaxic center. Okay, because it cannot do anything until the pneumotaxic center tells these centers down here, go ahead and put out some kind of electrical signals to regulate breathing, okay? The pneumotaxic center must receive that first. Now let's say that you are now trying to produce this involuntary normal ventilation. So you're trying to just produce tidal volume for the body, right? In an involuntary type of effort, which means you're subconsciously doing it. You're not even thinking about it. So therefore, the pneumotaxic center is going to relay this information back to the DRG. Okay, so that blue line is going to represent involuntary normal ventilation. Okay. From the DRG, there's two pathways that occurs. One pathway is an interneuron that goes all the way down to your thoracic spinal cord. The other pathway is for interneuron to project to your cervical spinal cord. And it will extend all the way to the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord, where your somatic motor neuron resides. Okay? So from the cervical spinal cord region, it will synapse with all of these cells, all these somatic motor cells, and these guys will exit out and will stimulate your diaphragm. So this somatic motor nerve is not an autonomic motor nerve because the diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, not a smooth muscle, right? So this somatic motor nerve is called your phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve is responsible for the regulation of the diaphragm. Whereas in the thoracic spinal cord levels, multiple thoracic levels, there's a series of these somatic motor nerves that will control the activities of your external intercostal muscle. And all of these nerves are known as your intercostal nerves. Okay, so intercostal nerves stimulate the activities of your external intercostal muscle. So therefore, if the phrenic nerve stimulate this to contract and stimulate this to contract, what phase of ventilation will you achieve? The inspiratory phase. Because by contracting these two muscle groups, you have now decreased the intrapulmonary pressure 3 millimeters of mercury below the atmospheric pressure, okay? Inhalation. All right, so now what if you want to, or what if somebody tells you, go ahead and breathe normally? So now you become conscious and you become aware of that breathing activities, right? So of course, all of these chemicals are constantly being transmitted back to the DRG. The DRG are constantly talking to the pneumotaxic center. But now the pneumotaxic center says, oh, you need to be aware of this. And in order for you to be aware of any activities that occurs inside your body, the information must be transmitted all the way up to the cortex. Okay, the pneumotaxic center cannot make that determination. These 4 centers are only there for the involuntary processes of your body. Okay, so therefore it must communicate all the way up to the cortex. So imagine here's the cortex up here. The pneumotaxic center now relay this information to the cortex. The cortex says, all right, thank you for letting me know. I'm now aware of what you're trying to do. So the cortex says, go ahead, pneumotaxic center, do what you must, okay? Pneumotaxic center says, thank you very much, I will do exactly that. So, from the pneumotaxic center, it now bypasses the dorsal respiratory group and relay this all the way to the ventral respiratory group. From the ventral respiratory group, there's also 2 pathways. One goes all the way down to the thoracic spinal cord, and the other one goes to the cervical spinal cord. And once it gets there, it stimulates the same somatic motor nerve. Because when you are breathing normally, even if it's under voluntary or conscious or awareness type of activities, you're still stimulating the contraction of these 2 muscle groups. Mainly, because you're still generating tidal volume, more so than anything else, right? Make sense? All right. Now, if we're talking about forced ventilation, you guys should understand different types of muscle comes into play. But you will not be responsible for that in terms of the chemoreceptor reflex. Okay, so for the chemoreceptor reflex, I only want you guys to know either the involuntary phase of normal ventilation or the voluntary phase of normal ventilation. So voluntary phase, the purple line. Involuntary phase, the blue line, right? So like taking the BART, you gotta know which line to take, otherwise you wanna go Richmond and you hop on the wrong train, you're gonna end up in San Francisco. Any questions about this?
Okay, so like let's say the partial pressure of oxygen is high, like that they detected is high.
Well, if it's high, it doesn't matter. Let's just say the partial pressure of CO2 is high.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
CO2 is high, then it'll
Then what do you wanna do? Do you wanna breathe faster or you wanna breathe slower?
faster.
Yeah, you wanna breathe faster so you can get rid of that CO2. What if your partial pressure oxygen is low?
Same thing.
You wanna breathe faster or slower? What do you think?
Faster.
You actually wanna breathe slower. Cause you take longer to inhale, which means you take in more oxygen, right? So you think about it, when you have an increase in partial pressure of CO2, and this is the reason why for oxygen, it takes a long and drastic change for that oxygen in order for your respiratory rate to kick in. But because, let's say if you start changing the CO2, immediately that's gonna be a change in your respiratory rate. By changing your respiratory rate, you're actually already now changing some amount of oxygen contents as well, right? The amount of oxygen that you have is a lot inside your body. So therefore, even if you have a very small decrease in oxygen or whatever it is, it doesn't trigger that much of a reflex. It's not until the partial pressure oxygen decreases below 60 millimeters of mercury, then it will trigger a very powerful respiratory reflex. So when this partial pressure of oxygen is now less than 60 millimeters of mercury, and that is in the arterial blood, then it triggers a reflex we call the hypoxic drive. But other than that, it doesn't really generate much changes in respiration once that oxygen deviates slightly, because the partial pressure of CO2, once it deviates slightly, it already triggered that change in respiration. And if you change your respiration rate, you already can effectively change your partial pressure of oxygen. So, yeah.
So, high CO2 will make it, will increase the reflex. If it's low.
And of those two chemoreceptors, the carotid bodies are a lot more sensitive than the aortic bodies, which means it will produce a much more powerful effect. Okay, so we call those chemoreceptors your peripheral chemoreceptors. So these guys are your peripheral. Chemoreceptors. We also have a set of chemoreceptors that is centrally located. Okay, so for the central chemoreceptors, they're actually located in the medulla oblongata. Now, imagine if you have the medulla. Okay, and you have a bunch of these chemoreceptors. So on here you have the central chemoreceptors. And in this particular space here, so here's the blood. And in this particular space, this is the CSF. Okay, that's the fluid component inside your central nervous system. Okay, so the central chemoreceptor only cares about changes in pH. It doesn't care about anything else. Because the changes in pH, if it's slight, it actually can cause some neurological damages, causes the neurons to become damaged. So therefore, it will react mainly to the pH changes. So let's just say this, if you have an increase, or let's say a decrease in pH inside your blood, right? If you have some kind of acidity inside your blood, which is basically a decrease in pH. If you have a decrease in pH inside your blood, what does that tell you about the amount of hydrogen ions inside the blood? It's higher, right? So you have an increase in hydrogen ions. Now, hydrogen ion being an ion cannot transport easily from the blood into the CSF because that's the blood-brain barrier that prevents that from happening. But if you have an increase in hydrogen ion concentration, what's going to happen to your CO2 concentration? It'll also increase. Why? Because of that equation that you guys need to know. So if you take this all the way back, I'm not going to draw the whole thing, you guys should know it, right? You will have an increase in CO2. CO2 is a gas. It can diffuse wherever it wants to. So therefore, this increase in CO2 will diffuse into the CSF. Once inside the CSF, CO2 is going to combine with water to form carbonic acid, which then is broken down into hydrogen ions plus bicarbonate. This is an increase in hydrogen ions inside the CSF now, which basically is translated to a decrease in pH. So now the CSF is becoming acidotic. And immediately the central chemoreceptors will detect this increase in hydrogen ion concentration, which is basically saying a decrease in pH. And it will, because this is located right next to the DRG, so it's gonna immediately contact the DRG. DRG will tell the pneumotaxic center, hey, we have an acidity inside the CSF, let's do something about it. Pneumotaxic center communicates with the cortex. Cortex says, okay, great, go ahead. Cortex relay back to the pneumotaxic. Pneumotaxic now goes to the VRG to now regulate that increase in ventilation. Right. Because anytime you have an increase in ventilation, for the most part, it is a conscious effort of breathing. As you start to breathe forcibly, you know that you're breathing forcibly. Okay. So, but you guys don't have to worry about how the forced ventilation works. Just know that in the body, there's two sets of chemoreceptors. There's a central chemoreceptor that detect mainly pH changes inside the CSF, and the peripheral chemoreceptors that detects all of these three changes in the arterial blood itself. Okay? And the peripheral chemoreceptor is going to initiate this chemoreceptor reflex to help maintain the CO2 level, help maintain the pH in the blood, and help maintain the oxygen levels inside the blood. Okay? Now you know everything for the exam on Wednesday. Go study and do well. Any questions about this?